what this does is it shows you, as we have obviously a lot of natural, kind of consolidation in our space that's occurring with private equity. As the buyers become more sophisticated, what you see is actually a lot of focus on how do we continue to control more of the patient, experience, if you will, and then how do we monetize, those efforts in terms of providing other services that we outsource.
This episode was brought to you by Surrogacy Roadmap, a self-led educational course created by Family Inceptions. How many social media surrogacy matches have you come across? Get your free lesson from surrogacyroadmap.com/4-professionals. That's surrogacyroadmap.com/4-professionals. Today's advertiser helped make the production and delivery of this episode possible for free to you. But the themes expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health, nor of the advertiser. The advertiser does not have editorial control over the content of this episode, and the guest's appearance is not an endorsement of the advertiser.
Can you just be a fertility clinic anymore? And I don't even mean can you just be an independently owned fertility clinic anymore. I mean, like, even if you're a large group, a network of fertility clinics, multi-state, multi-lab even, will you be able to get away with providing lab and clinical services only? Or will you have to integrate into other verticals? Vertical integration is happening in the fertility field. It's not just Kindbody, it's not just Recharge Capital in Southeast Asia. I suspect with these massive capital firms like KKR and BlackRock entering the fertility field, that we are going to see a lot more vertical integration. And so that's why I brought in my guest, Louis Villalba. Lou has recently been promoted to CEO of Tomorrow. He was the CEO of Geneo Biomedics, and he's led commercial divisions for a number of different companies in the space. To make the distinction between vertical integration and horizontal integration, Lou lays out the 5 main ancillary services in the fertility space. This is from the point of view of the fertility clinic. Safety and technology, storage, lab, egg banks, which I'm guessing he would just say gamete banks, and surrogacy services. He talks about the buyers like KKR bringing a new level of sophistication to their approach to controlling the value chain. Lou makes the argument against concentrating ancillary services, and he makes the argument for it. In the argument against, he talks about the risk of a headcount and new buckets of liability. I push him a little bit about what the strength of a balance sheet means. How relative is it in the time that we're in now, where capital is starting to tighten up, versus 5 years ago when seemingly anyone could get a loan for a low amount of money, for a low amount of interest. We talk a little bit about major lawsuits that have been recent, like the Chart Inc. lawsuit from the Pacific Fertility Center failure 5 years ago, what that would look like in a vertically integrated fertility field. With regard to the healthiness of the balance sheet, Lou talks about the healthiness of gross margins for fertility networks. What's the good end of the range? What's a poor end of the range? In the argument for, Lou talks about the sweet spot for where it makes sense for a fertility company to acquire a related service. I ask him about backward integration, moving closer toward the raw material, versus forward integration, moving closer towards the end patient consumer. I ask him about what Tomorrow is up to. Lou gives his opinion on if it's a 5-horse race among the largest fertility clinic networks, what will happen next in that dynamic, like consolidation between horses 2 through 5. I name some companies and I ask Lou to tell me who he thinks are the front runners right now. And then finally, I ask Lou to speculate on when we might start to see some antitrust regulation happening in the field. We've seen a little bit. There's more integration happening. Politically, there might be an appetite for trust busting on the populist waves of both the left and the right, according to my amateur political analysis. And Lou gives his thoughts. Enjoy this episode about the inevitability of vertical integration in the fertility space with Lou Villalba. Mr. Villalba, Lou, welcome to the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
Thank you, Griffin. Happy to be here with you.
I'm happy to have you on because you and I have gotten to know each other over the past few months, but recently we were at a meeting, and when you and I were just having a side conversation about vertical integration, I was like, stop, I need to be recording this. I got to get this into a podcast episode. And I want to ask you all sorts of things about vertical integration, about specifically what's happening in the field, of like how necessary it is, when it backfires, how people go forward and backward. But let's maybe start with just how you would describe vertical integration and ancillary services, and introduce the theme for us.
Sure. Sounds great. No, appreciate it and appreciate the discussion. So if we look today in terms of ancillary services, and let's say, for example, we focus on some of the larger IVF networks in the US, a lot of these groups have taken a look at, bringing on into their operations what I'll call 5 different components. One is safety and technology. So anything they can do to automate their existing platform on a day-to-day basis. Second would be storage. Obviously, as storage, is some people outsource, some people have actually started to manage directly on their own. Then obviously you have genetic labs, which is a very big, important part of the day-to-day business as we see networks starting to own their own labs and integrate and actually acquire some of the labs and services they were using. Then you have egg banks and you have surrogacy services. So these are generally the 5 major components of ancillary services that most networks are concentrated on. And not only networks, but if the single providers are large enough in terms of scale, they would also benefit from, concentrating on these types of components.
So would some of these be examples of horizontal integration? Like, I guess it depends on where you are in the journey, right? Like, because if it's third-party IVF, then I suppose that having the egg bank and the surrogacy services as a part of the chain would be vertical. But how do you distinguish horizontal versus vertical in this case?
Yeah, no, it's an important question, and we'll just take a quick step back. So if you look, for example, at like Innovation Fertility, it's prior to their merging with U.S. Fertility, and you look at the services they were offering. I think they were a lab focused network, right? That basically took on a lot of different aspects. They had storage. They hired actually a sales team led by some highly qualified talent to go out and sell their genetic lab services, their storage services, and amongst other things. And they were looking to expand that as they went into their merger. So time will tell with U.S. Fertility what they choose to do. So if you compare that to vertical or horizontal, integration, you can make the case that if it's their own existing, kind of physicians that they support, that would be more of a horizontal. If they take it out to other, entities, we could talk about vertical integration in terms of those types of services. But I think first and foremost, what this does is it shows you, as we have obviously a lot of natural kind of consolidation in our space that's occurring with private equity. As the buyers become more sophisticated, what you see is actually a lot of focus on how do we continue to control more of the patient, experience, if you will, and then how do we monetize, those efforts in terms of providing other services that we outsource. Now, there's obviously, like all good things in life, there's a lot of execution as you continue to offer more services that's required from a network perspective. And if you think of day-to-day care versus bringing on additional services, it brings on a different set of circumstances that you have to execute to provide that patient experience.
So when you say buyers are becoming more sophisticated, you're not talking about the fertility patient and consumer. You're talking about the business-to-business buyer, the buyers purchasing clinics, clinic networks, and fertility companies?
So I would say we have sophistication increasing on both sides, okay? And I would say that obviously the buyers are becoming more sophisticated. You look at KKR's acquisition, paying $2.5 billion for Evie. Now, RMA, that's a major player. There's no larger private equity group in the world that's probably going to get into into IVF outside of a BlackRock, let's say, of something of that nature. So what does, a purchaser of that, kind of bandwidth bring? It brings a level of sophistication that is different in terms of how the business has actually grown. I always love to point out, we're 44 years old in the world in terms of the oldest IVF baby, right? And so this business was, this industry was built on the backs of a lot of great healthcare providers that, established IVF to where it is today. And that attention continues to multiply in terms of the buyers that are coming in to this space now. So we see progenies of the world going directly to the patients, right? They go to employers, they offer benefits. That creates a level of sophistication that takes a middleman out of the equation, and now you see these types of providers starting to influence patient treatment patterns, right? In terms of where they go, what types of services are offered, what things are covered. We see obviously a lot of if you look, in my opinion, if you look at a Massachusetts or in Illinois, and you look at the mandates that have been approved in those states for some time, that's the future of IVF in the United States to a certain extent, okay? We're going to see that type of coverage continuing to expand as it should and provide more coverage to patients, because we know that, currently right now, there's nowhere near enough treatment for the amount of demand that's in the market today.
So do you think a lot of the drive towards vertical integration is coming from the investor side? Is this part of the investor thesis now? Is this how much is it coming from operators that feel like, well, I just simply need to do this in order to complete the rest of our business plan, versus investors coming in with it as part of their thesis? And is it part of almost every investor's thesis now?
I think that, every investor is going to look to obviously maximize their investment, right? And how do you do that? Do you do that by controlling more ancillary services, and increase profit through providing, or controlling that type of the business? And there's a great debate that goes on. There are some network CEOs that, would argue that concentrating on ancillary services is not the right way to increase profitability and, in an IVF network. Actually seeing more patients as a way to actually increase profitability is what some would say. Others would argue and say, look, this is the best way for me to control quality. This is the best way for me to control safety. And yes, for controlling those things, I probably will realize a better profit. Okay. In terms of, where they will call the sweet spot from a risk and profitability equation, I think a lot of that depends on scale. So once you reach a certain size and you're obviously, your volumes obviously support these types of investment, these make it natural sense for some businesses to take on this type of service. But it doesn't come without risk, right? And anytime you actually perform an additional service for patients, that comes with an execution, responsibility that's on the back end. And let's look at, for example, at genetic labs. All right. So genetic labs obviously have grown tremendously in the last, let's say, 7 to 10 years. Okay. You look at where things started with PGS and you just follow the natural equation, to where we are today with PGTA, et cetera. And what you'll see is a lot of, networks now, once they reach a certain size, taking on their own genetic labs. Okay. So in terms of, the responsibility that comes with providing, let's say, a genetic test, the results, there is an enormous professional liability that you don't have as a care provider, but you do as a genetic lab operator. And so these are the types of considerations that I think people go through, and they have to look at, what type of, professional liability insurance do I need to carry outside of my malpractice insurance to perform these types of services.
Okay, so there's a couple different ways. I'm making some notes because I want to dive back into risk. I want to talk about controlling the value chain to best ensure the patient experience. I want to first start on asking you to steelman the argument that concentrating on ancillary services not the best way to increase profit, but that to just focus on patient volume is. Whether that's your position or not, I'm just asking you to steelman it. What's the argument there?
So one of the most expensive parts of any services business is headcount, and the amount of headcount required to provide additional services actually increases your expense level, right? So on one end of the equation, you're going to argue that my top line revenue is going to increase, right? Because I'm now going to bill out and enjoy the profit that I was outsourcing to a genetic lab, previously, if I manage that responsibility on my own. So the other part's going to be, when you look at any IVF clinic in terms of a network or a well-run business, the general P&L statements of an IVF clinic are going to range in, unfortunately, the low 20% when things aren't run well, to probably the low 40% when they're run close to perfectly. Okay. So if that is your range, 20 to 40% in terms of your profit, and you're going to reinvest that back into offering additional services to your patients, you don't have a lot of runway for margin of error. So if you take on a responsibility, for example, like storage, and you actually go out, you acquire a facility, you make the investment, you actually are bringing on additional risk now because you have an outsourced facility where you're storing some of your most, precious, kind of resources of any IVF, network. And then you are going to manage that on a day-to-day basis with additional headcount, okay, in terms of managing that responsibility. So those types of risks you manage, obviously, in your clinic one way. When you outsource to a different facility that you're running, okay, that you're not eliminating risk, you're actually bringing on additional risk to yourself, but more importantly, you're actually increasing your expense level. And so that relationship between risk and reward is an important equation when ancillary services comes up for clinics to consider. Because if we said, for example, your revenue per patient is going to increase if you concentrate, just on the patient experience within your own clinic versus, managing outside services, I think that's an important distinction any CEO would want to think through as they make a decision on, managing things directly versus outsourcing.
If the trend of vertical integration really continues and the number of fertility clinic groups that remain unintegrated gets smaller, do they have to have a really strong consumer brand in order to maintain that niche and not be in all of the other verticals?
Yeah, it's important. So think about this, all right? So your patient experience is obviously, in the journey is created by so many different interactions, right? It's the interaction from when you walk in to when you sit down with, let's say, a nurse before you get to the MD, or in some cases where embryologists do speak with patients that, they have those types of interactions. You bring in ancillary services, and let's say, God forbid, you have a bad experience with a genetic lab, okay? Where does that brand reputation get hit? Does it get hit on the clinic, or does it get hit for the genetic lab if it's an outside service? It's going to go on to the clinic, right? Generally, because that's where the direct patient experience is. And so I think that the ability to build a strong brand in this space is encompasses all of those points of interaction. And so the more that you're obviously, focused on the things that you can do to increase your brand awareness and create a good experience, the better off, your interactions with patients are going to be. And that's going to be the strength of your brand. The quality of the people that you partner with is going to be the strength of your brand. Okay. And I think that's, what will eventually, rise to the surface in this equation as people, look like in all types of, of businesses. The more points of execution you have in any equation, the higher risk you have, right? And so if you want to bring on, additional, points of execution into your care model, you have to realize that you're going to need the management involved and the expertise involved to execute against, those responsibilities. And I think that the attraction of the profit is one part of the equation. The execution of the quality is extremely important because that involves safety, which at the end of the day, we're all most, focused on.
Let's go to a different industry for a second where safety is less of the concern and it isn't as serious as what people do in this field. But we were just in California recently, and I don't eat fast food normally, but every time I'm in California, Lou, I just want In-N-Out burger. And so last time we were at PCRS and I'm getting In-N-Out burger, and I'm really curious about the company, and it's a $3 billion company, Lou, no franchises.
Right.
Owned almost entirely by one woman. Now, granted, she's an heiress. It was her grandfather, I think, and then her father and her uncle didn't have heirs, if I remember the story correctly. But this is a $3 billion company, no franchises, highly profitable. I haven't really dug in, but I don't think a ton of vertical integration. I think they mostly occupy their spot. Contrast that with McDonald's, let's say, and I think McDonald's their parent company owns a bunch of shares of Coke, and they probably own the distributors, or at least some parts of the distributors that for their suppliers, and they own the potato farms in some cases, and or at least independent contract them like they do, and so who would you rather own? Would you rather own In-N-Out Burger in that situation, or would you rather be the equivalent level shareholder in terms of capital at McDonald's, and why?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great scenario, and I love the In-N-Out story. Being a long-time Californian, it's just a fantastic, I think, example of one family that controlled the entire evolution of that brand. Starting out, obviously as a Southern California-based business, they knew they had a high-quality product. They have been enticed along the way. You can imagine every year with their growth of someone to come in from a private equity side, acquire this, scale it, nationalize it. And, from that create it into a worldwide brand. But what they figured out early on was, obviously there's always more than one route to success, right? And their route to success was going to be about staying as a high quality brand. And so, not to say that other brands aren't high quality, but they definitely have stayed a higher quality brand, which is why they have such a cult following. And whenever their distribution centers in terms of where their products go out to the different stores, those have been very geographically selected, right? So there are only a certain number of hours on a truck, from the distribution point to actually the point of, of service. And I believe that model in healthcare has some similarities, right? So we, first and foremost, we have, we want safety and we want success, right? And success in my mind is quality in this. And so what we want to continue to do is we want to build, obviously, points of care that deliver the highest success and the highest safety and the best patient experience possible, right? Everything encompasses into that patient experience. That's why the patient referral in our business is still by far the most effective referral, no matter how much money, technology, artificial intelligence we spend in trying to control, the patient pathway. Patient referrals still drive, a majority of a lot of our business. And we know in terms of the number of diagnoses, versus the number of treatable patients, we've got a lot of room, for continued growth in this business. Quality is, in my opinion, going to be one of the most important things for us to build IVF worldwide in terms of its reputation. We need to continue to support high quality providers and high quality standards.
Why are some third-party IVF programs thriving while others are barely getting by? How do fertility centers convert more patients that need third-party IVF? Fertility centers face increased competition, making patient retention in third-party IVF a challenge. Issues arise as cycles do not come to fruition. Insufficient review of gestational carriers' medical records. Overlooking mental health and legal expertise, causing chaos. Limited staffing, pulling nurses and coordinators away for extra attention. Family Inceptions, with 15 plus years of experience, introduces the Surrogacy Roadmap. This solution empowers intended parents to review and qualify surrogates, seamlessly prepare for clinic screening, address costs up front, covering compensations, escrow, and insurances, navigate contingencies at every trimester, engage with reproductive professionals and attorneys, prepare comprehensively for pregnancy and postpartum care. Intended parents pay for Surrogacy Roadmap. Clinics simply refer their nightmare IVF surrogacy cases to Surrogacy Roadmap. Get your free lesson from surrogacyroadmap.com/4-professionals. That's surrogacyroadmap.com/4-professionals.
And you get very tangible examples of what In and Out does, but of also what other people do. So I think if people do want to maintain that route, that thinking of what those indicators of quality are and truly investing them is necessary, as opposed to just saying, oh, we've got a good reputation. I don't think that's going to count. I think quality has to be a measurable strategy in that situation. At least I suspect it does. I want to have you steelman the case for controlling the value chain. But before we do that, is there also a strategy that can be applied if you don't control the value chain, that you can pit vendors against each other? Like, I'm thinking of what seems to me to have happened in genetics. Like you have the fertility networks and they're driving down the price, having all the genetics companies compete with each other. And so that seems to me like a cost-saving strategy that might not be duplicable if you also own that vertical. Or am I missing something?
No, you're not missing anything. So look, there are only, when a patient walks through the entrance of a clinic and actually and arrives for care, you call it whatever. There are 30 unique events for you, for example, to drive, revenue on a patient, right? There's so there's screening on the front end. There's diagnosis. There's obviously pharmaceutical treatment. And then you actually get into, obviously, trying to, produce eggs, right? Oocytes or do a sperm analysis. So then you get into your laboratory process, right? And within your, what we'll call your case rate, all of the fees that are associated at case rate are to cover everything to, let's say, a blastocyst production and then a transfer, right? A retrieval and a transfer. And so when you take, in terms of the number of steps that are in a case rate, and you say the value that's been assigned, to that case rate, then the only thing you can do on the back end of that is sell additional screening, additional storage, additional services, to patients. And that, in terms of what's, the ability for them to kind of increase the revenue per patient, that's where people are evaluating, obviously, where are the options there. And under our current, care paradigm today, it's a pretty strict protocol in terms of how you can actually increase revenue, within an IVF clinic. Other people are trying to expand the, let's say the, kind of care, option, meaning that they're not just going to do reproductive health, they're going to do gynecological services, right? So that gets into well woman visits, that gets into more of a general maintenance of, of a female health life. And that is where they're trying to say, look, we built this infrastructure. We want to drive more, patient volume through this infrastructure. Women's health services actually can encompass not just reproductive care, it can also, encompass, gynecologic care. And so that's where I think you'll see, in terms of the focus continue to evolve. We'll see this. Now, it hasn't succeeded. People have tried it in the past. Was it too early? Was it not the right design? Was it, and let's say, for example, geographically, not kind of aligned in terms of, with patient mindsets? There's a lot of factors that go into expanding, obviously, patient care. But I think with the level of sophistication that is now coming into IVF, we're going to see some successful models that expand the care continuum.
Is there something to be said about the timing right now that impacts the risk that you started to talk about? You talked about both legal liability, which I want to talk some more about, but you talked a bit about financial risk. Is there a risk, especially now, of being over leveraged if you're acquiring other companies in other verticals? And maybe 3 years ago, it would have been fine because if you started to stretch out your runway, you just borrow some extra capital at a very low interest rate. And now that interest rates are higher, it appears that lenders are getting a bit tighter. A couple of the big lenders like Silicon Valley Bank and Signature have gone under. And I suspect that there's rumors of a couple, of a bankruptcy or two or a mass layoff or two in the pipeline. When it happens, we'll report on it. Right now, they're just rumors, but I think that some of them will happen because of the climate that we're in. What is the timing that we're in right now due to vertical integration that might otherwise happen in the fertility field?
Right. So the businesses that, have weaker balance sheets obviously are not in a position to go out and acquire ancillary services or invest in ancillary services because they're obviously, they're financing their current levels, of debt if they have them. And so that puts them obviously in a more conservative, position in terms of looking at, building these types of, of care, this type of service, for their patients. What that does, though, is it means the independent providers that obviously specialize in these types of ancillary services, the strength of their business obviously starts to rise to the surface. And then what you'll see in competition, as we've seen obviously in the genetic screening world, and you'll see in the storage world, you'll see in, and obviously the surrogacy services, not to the same extent, but definitely at some level, and egg banks. You'll see, obviously the force of competition. People will negotiate. The strength and the size of some of these organizations will mean that they're going to pay, they're going to actually save money in terms of, providing these types of services through a third party. And they'll leverage that, to increase their profitability on a per patient basis by not carrying all the expense of actually hiring headcount, investing in technology, all the things that are required to, to deliver these types of ancillary services. They'll approach it, in what I'll say the good old fashioned way, which is their core competencies is what they'll focus on. They'll outsource the things that aren't, important to their, or central to their core competencies and rely on high quality partners to deliver that level of care.
Are businesses trying to improve their cash position right now so that they can still continue a vertical integration strategy even if capital tightens up?
Yeah, I would say, you have obviously a lot of private equity buyers that are coming to space, and everyone in the private equity world has a longer, you can say a shorter or a longer term, strategy, and that's to monetize the assets that they've acquired, right? So the way that you monetize, obviously, is you have the balance sheet, be as strong as possible. And then you're either going to go to the public equity markets, or you're going to roll them up and sell them in a bigger, to a bigger consortium that has a longer term vision. I think some of the big players in this space that have come in have a longer term view. Okay. I think a lot of the initial private equity that we attracted and that the reproductive health actually has, experienced in the last, we'll call it 3 years, is a shorter term view. It's something in that 3 to 5 year time horizon. I think the bigger players actually look at things in a 10-year time horizon. They're not as reactive to market conditions like we see today, where some of the we'll say the smaller players, they have to return on the funds that they've committed, and they actually have to show obviously returns to the shareholders that they're providing for. So this will benefit us, I think, over time as we mature and we get in longer term relationships with bigger providers that have longer term views.
Whether the strategy and the outlook is long-term or short-term, the strength of a balance sheet is still somewhat relative, isn't it? Relative to if there's money that can be easily borrowed or received some other way versus it looks like things are tight. Not only are capital markets tight, but also our AR is starting to age out more. It was at 45 and now it's at 60, or now it's closer to 90. And so what is the strength of a balance sheet have to look like nowadays?
Yeah, so I think in a services model where you see again these kind of general returns, in a high quality IVF clinic, you'll see close to kind of a low 40s in terms of gross margin. Okay, and then let's say in an underperformer, you can see something as low as as 20%. So if you think in terms of that's your gross margin and what you have to invest in and what type of investment you're going to attract into a business like that, people are going to want to see, obviously, they're going to want to see that your balance sheet is improving over time, that you have growth in terms of the services that you're providing. So we have a lot of what I'll call the central checkpoints that can acquire and attract investors into the space. What a lot of it kind of comes down to is now, what is the management skill set to execute and show improvement in terms of the profitability of these businesses over time? And so that strength actually has to come through in what we'll call higher quality performance. And that performance now is starting to be looked at under a different lens, because you have seasoned investors that actually hold these groups obviously accountable to to delivering the results that they expect. Now, that's not always an attractive comment within healthcare, and I completely understand. The reality is, medicine is a business. Okay, of course, our job is to provide the highest quality of care. And one would argue, if we provide high quality care, the business will sort itself out. And I think that's very accurate, because if we're doing the right thing in terms for the patient, we're going to build this market, and there's plenty of growth, plenty of greenfield in front of this space for everyone to appreciate, in the years to come.
So you talked a bit about the risk liability, and one example that you gave was, well, if you're in the clinical vertical, for example, you have your malpractice liability, but then if you go into a lab vertical, a storage vertical, there's other liability that you have. What other examples are there in terms of legal risks that people need to consider when they're moving into other verticals?
Yeah, so kind of the two categories fall between professional liability, okay, and personal liability, right? And so professional liability, you're an MD, you're an embryologist, you have you have your normal set of standards that you perform, or steps you perform on a day-to-day basis. So those are covered generally, your malpractice policies, and because that's what's designed to cover that part of your day-to-day job. When you start to expand the types of services that you offer, for example, something in genetics, you start to actually take on providing a result, right? And a result that people are going to continue to make clinical evaluations against, and make, more importantly, care decisions against, right? And so when you look, for example, at the accuracy of the test results that you provide, obviously, if they're the lower the accuracy, the more risk there is in terms of the type of guidance you provide. You obviously include all types of fair balance statements saying something's 97, 98% successful or predictable. But guess what? That still leaves you a little bit of a window, of risk there. All right. And so that isn't risk that if you are outsourcing, you carry it from a malpractice standpoint. Okay. But you don't carry it, directly as a professional liability perspective. And those are the types of, important, considerations that any network or any clinic needs to think through if they want to expand, into ancillary services. For example, in storage, if you actually have, let's say, for example, 10,000 patients in one site that you're storing from a legacy inventory, and you have some type of tank failure, which unfortunately happens from time to time. Where does that risk fall if it's if you're providing that service on your own versus outsource? The answer is it falls everywhere, but it's going to fall to one side more, okay, if you're actually, so to speak, holding the bag on that, directly. And that is, that's an important consideration, I think, as people get into this. And some of the sophisticated buyers now are obviously forcing, some of these networks to actually look outside, to use third-party services, for these ancillary steps that are involved in the business.
You're making me think of the recent Chart Inc. settlements. So Chart Inc. was, I believe, the manufacturer of the tanks at Pacific Fertility Center. I don't know if they also were for the Cleveland Clinic as well, but, I think patients sued Pacific Fertility Center sued Chart. I think patients sued Chart directly, then Chart went and I believe one of their suppliers was Extron, and so they're suing Extron. So either that doesn't get to happen if you're vertically integrated because you're just being sued at all of those points, or is it like the McDonald's example where it's like that one little vendor that, because no one's vertically integrated in absolutely everything, right? Like even Amazon still buys some things from other people, and so does that? If you're in that type of situation, does that put someone at a position where it's like, okay, this is how the it was 90% through our different verticals and maybe 10% through this supplier that we had, but we're going to squash this supplier in a legal battle and make it seem like it was 50% their liability. Like, is that something we might expect to see?
I think, the trial lawyers are always, very focused on going towards the deepest pockets wherever they're positioned. So if there's a path to, get into that party in the equation, they will find it and they'll naturally end up there. You bring up a good example in terms of the equation that's involved, like for any finished product, there are, generally a consortium of different providers that, all, have their contributions to a finished product. The quality piece that comes out on the back end of that, in terms of who's responsible for checking that and managing that, those are always a central point of where most of the liability is probably going to, fall on the shoulders of. But that's, that in terms of a physician's office or an IVF clinic is why there's so much risk for them in this type of ancillary service. And so I think what, for example, what we learned in the Pacific Fertility case is that, not only did we have, a long list of people that are going to be, kind of subpoenaed in this, we also learned another important thing. The technology that's involved today, that was involved at that point, was completely inadequate in terms of identifying the problem, right? The alarm systems that's set up now are set up to be reactive. They're not set up to be predictive. And where we need to shift in these types of ancillary services, where I think most of the providers are currently doing this, is they actually have things that predict. They monitor things like LN2 consumption. They monitor oxygen. They monitor temperature. They remote access into these systems because they watch them 24/7. And that's the type of focus that we need to improve the quality within reproductive health, because that's the trust the patients are putting in us in terms of building, this, obviously service into something that's extremely, high quality.
Well, then let's shift to that quality argument about controlling the value chain. So we've gone through the cons of integration and the potential risks and the pros to perhaps just focusing on patient volume or focusing on one piece of the vertical as opposed to integrating. Now let's talk about the pros and steelman that argument. If controlling the value chain ends up appearing to be totally necessary in the next 5 to 10 years, why might that be?
So I think, every business has what we'll call a sweet spot, just in terms of the amount of, let's say, kind of strategy, technology, headcount investment that you have into a business. That investment's actually going to help you, let's say, for example, maximize your quality, maximize your return on investment. figuring out where that intersection is in every business is a critical part. And I think that, if you look in terms of the healthcare services model that we're involved in, you think of the number of headcount that's involved within an IVF clinic. You can think about, the administration side, think about the lab, in terms of embryologists, technicians, et cetera. Think on the MD side. And then as you add different ancillary services, they're going to have to add headcount to manage those responsibilities. So, there's a volume that at a certain point, it's going to make sense, right? And then there's an argument that says, until you reach that volume, or if you have to increase your headcount to a point because the volume is so large, then, you have to ask yourself, I have buying power. Am I better off doing this and managing this internally under my own roof, or am I better off negotiating a very competitive deal with a high quality provider? And that's the trend that's in front of us. And that's what I think we'll see, in the next 2 to 5 years, we'll see this. And we see the negotiations right now. There's, discussions underway at this point for all the networks to actually band together to have, competitive purchasing agreements with some of the major providers of this space. So it's naturally occurring. I think it's just part of the maturity of reproductive health. And we'll continue to see this evolve, I believe, strongly over the next few years.
What about those vertical integrators that seem to have no sweet spot? You said there's a sweet spot that makes sense because it has got, but then you look at like Tesla and it's like, man, he's buying everything. You look at Amazon, it's like, okay, now they got the cloud services. Oh, and they have Whole Foods. So they've got that distribution. Now they're in content creation so that their products are everywhere, so that you're not leaving Amazon, you're not going to Netflix, you're not leaving Amazon, you're staying, you're watching your videos in Prime, buying your products in Prime. Oh, I'll buy the Washington Post too, just because it can't hurt to be in DC when you're playing at this level. And so it seems so. I mean, I know those are like the top of the top examples, but how likely is it that we'll see someone in the fertility field that doesn't seem to have that sweet spot? They're like, we're going to be in absolutely everything that touches the patient.
So, there's so much execution, right, in the examples that you just provided. So, for example, in Amazon, we look at where Amazon started, and, the argument was it's never going to be a profitable company. You can remember that, for many, many years, right? But what did they do? They continued to grow their top line, and they continued to consolidate, against their original foundation in a step-by-step fashion, right? They didn't grow into the company they are today just overnight. This is several years of high quality acquisitions, several years of high quality management of a business, and it built a brand that people trust. And so, how do they control the American, the worldwide consumers' buying behavior now? They're seen as a high quality provider, and they have a trusted brand, right? So I think same thing applies to Tesla in a big way, right? They were, pioneers in the EV market, but they also had a premium brand to begin with, right? Who didn't aspire to have a Tesla, let's say back in like the 2007 and 2010 range when they were more scarce, right? Now it's a common brand. People see it around, they see it everywhere. And and they've created different price points to bring different levels of the market in. And what are we continuing to see in terms of reproductive healthcare? Some will argue that obviously, like for example, in the U.S., we have in terms of cost of treatment, we've created a market that only, treats a certain segment of the market. And so we have other entities that have come in, for example, like a Kind Body, that say our mission is to create, is to improve access to care. We want to do things at a lower price point. We have these efforts now to go directly to the employers, to the progenies of the world, right? To manage the cost associated, with treatment, so we can encourage, companies to invest more in reproductive healthcare and treatment. And so all of these things, I think, are growing, our industry right in front of our eyes. In terms of who's going to consolidate them and who's going to maximize, I think you look to some of, the recent acquisitions that have taken place when you attract the names of like a KKR. Their long-term view obviously has a long-term strategy. And if you look at the brands that they're buying, I think one could argue there are some high quality brands. So I would look, at those types of buyers to see who's going to kind of set the strategy for what pieces are going to be rolled up and at what time, because there's a lot of consolidation still in front of us. But, the foundation in terms of the number of clinics that we have that are available today to treat patients, I believe that number is going to continue to increase over the next few years.
So we might see it from the behemoths that are coming in, like KKR, and maybe BlackRock will too, and some others. Who do you suspect is in the lead right now? So you mentioned U.S. Fertility. We'll see what they end up doing. I might guess Kindbody, from just what I can see in terms of they got clinics. I don't know if they still do the mobile testing, but they had that. They've got the employer benefit carve out. They've since gone into a third party. I believe they acquired a gestational carrier agency. The one is escaping me right now, but so and I think they expanded EOS when they bought Vios, so they're more in a third party. So I might guess them. Who's charging ahead, and who are the front runners right now?
Well, if you look in terms of volume size cycles and who has control right now, it's, U.S. Fertility controls obviously a majority of the market from that perspective. You start to go down the list from there. And I think there's some arguments that if it's a 5-horse race and you have one that's in the lead right now, horses between number 2 and number 5, if they consolidate together, you're going to have more of an equal parity in terms of volume and size. And I expect that those are the next moves that we'll see in front of us. Okay. I mean, you look at groups like Pinnacle that have been high growth in terms of the number of acquisitions that they've made over the last few years. Now with valuations actually coming down to a more respectable level and a more competitive level, I think that the ones with the strong balance sheets, we're going to see them continue to accelerate their acquisition strategies over the next 12 to 18 months because prices are more competitive than they were, just 12 months ago. And in terms of, what shifts in the business strategies for some of these networks, I think that there's a tremendous amount of evaluation going on right now about what is the next natural extension for their care paradigm to offer to this patient group. And I think that, we have success rates, obviously, that are, continuing to improve year over year. Some might argue that our live birth rates aren't, accelerating. This is a complicated field to succeed in. I think everyone knows that. But I think in terms of like the number of blastocyst embryos that we're producing on a day-to-day basis, those percentages you cannot argue with. They've improved dramatically. Okay. There's a lot that goes into that, but, starting with the blastocyst embryo is obviously a great place to start in terms of long-term success for reproductive healthcare. So I think we'll continue to see, that the trust and the quality of the market improves year over year, which will be a natural, extension to bring in more people in for treatment.
Is this integration necessary in order to actually be able to implement a lot of the innovations that are happening? Because I see all these solutions coming in, and some of them are probably, they're not going to win. They're duds, and they maybe just be features. But some of them seem, it's like, I can really tell. I can see the value in that, but they're still having a hard time gaining adoption for whatever reason. And often it just has to do with the variance of workflow. So even if you have an MSO, you've often pasted those different clinics together. They've got different workflows, and often it's just not the same as like I had the CEO of Indira IVF from India, and he said, I hire 250 OBGYN physicians. I train them on fertility, meaning my company does, and I make sure they're all younger than me, so they all do the same thing. And so it's a lot easier to implement a lot of some of these scale innovations, and the workflow, the variance in workflow is one of the things that seems to hamper it. Is this vertical integration necessary in order to be able to get things in? Because there's a lot of things. It's like, man, you really do automate, you really do reduce that level of work that people have. But in order to implement it, it's an add-on for where people don't have capacity. So is this necessary in order to be able to implement the rest of the innovations?
Yeah. So, I think that if we think in terms of the meeting that we attended out in Napa together, one of the great debates is around, I practice evidence-based medicine. Okay. And so everyone's looking for evidence in terms of how they make decisions. And then I think what's equally there for a lot of people are looking at the cost of, the different decisions that they make. Okay. And so in terms of look at AI technologies and where they are today, if you went to someone and said, I'm going to give you higher quality information do you think you're going to be able to have a better chance of success? Okay. The short answer is going to be yes, right? Because people are qualified, and, part of the decisions that they make are based on the information they have. So, this whole, great debate on how much data you need to obviously, kind of make, let's say, a clinical decision, I think is a very important part of this equation. And the value of that data that you provide is what people are obviously thirsty for. And they're thirsty, for an advantage, right? So you'll see, some people obviously get on the front end of the equation in terms of, of acquiring, let's say, a technology before the middle of the market will adopt something, right? And so the early adopters, like if you look at an AI, you look at time-lapse imaging, you look at single-step media. I mean, there are a lot of markers that you can look at, but I think one of the more interesting things that, from a behavior standpoint is, you are not going to get what's called a standard of care where you're treating 51% of the addressable market with anything in a short period of time. It's just, there are so many, and factors involved with changing people's behavior around different things. And they can be business related, they can be behavior related, they can be control related in terms of you're in a network and your protocols get set and you're going to follow those, which, in the Indira equation, they're doing a great job of setting a standard that they want their groups to follow. I think the hardest thing to do in medicine is change behavior in terms of if you want to try and do it fast, because the faster, that you push, the harder that they resist. And that's just the natural, kind of ebb and flow of our market. I do think, from a society standpoint, we're continuing to set practice guidelines around very, very important things with innovation and how you present and offer those early innovations to patients. If people see things as an advantage, certain groups are always going to, obviously maximize that. They'll take advantage of it, and certain patients are going to be attracted to it. Okay. And if it's gone through a regulatory process, which in most, aspects it has, because if people are making clinical decisions, they've had to take it through an FDA clearance. They've had to take it through, some type of, it has to adhere to CLIA lab regulations, something of that nature. Where things get, unfortunately inconsistent is if they don't have to follow those types of controls, then one could have an argument about, hey, how did you, get to offer this to patients, right? Because if we look, in terms of today, so let's say, for example, of the 450 plus clinics we have in the US, most of them, probably are doing things, that don't have a lot of FDA clearance because they weren't required to do that, right? They have CLIA lab regulations, but, on a day-to-day basis, they've created their own SOPs, they're fine-running labs, and they adhere to those types of controls.
If this happens and someone is kind of driving it at the vertical level, I'm just picking on Kindbody. I'm not saying it's them, but Gino has of course said that vertical integration is part of their thesis, and touching all of the parts of the value chain is part of their thesis. And so let's just say it's them, and they own EMR, own pharmacy, own everything. For those that don't, does that force them to, even though they're not integrating as businesses, they have to have more integrative features does it force the pharmacies that are left, the EMRs that are left, the scheduling softwares, et cetera, that are left to have to communicate with each other in order to and have more interoperative functionality? Because otherwise it seems to me like it would be a cheetah against a poodle.
Yeah, right. So there's definitely a level of efficiency with automation, right? And offering a complete, let's say, offering in terms of, from pharmaceutical through, let's say delivery of a healthy, happy baby. And so if that is in terms of your longer term, care strategy, the pressure on the business is to demonstrate that they can manage that in a cost effective way, right? So there's a rush to control all these different steps. What we haven't seen yet is the importance, output on the back end. Is it more cost effective? Are your outcomes better? All of the things that are generally going to drive, longer term investment, longer term strategy. I think it's a natural maturity cycle that we're going through, as an industry. And I think it's the right normal thing to do. I think the question will become, all right, so what are the most important, steps in my business? What steps do I need to control to provide the best experience for my patients, and hopefully delivering healthy, happy babies? And what's really rolled up into that. Okay. And, and that's, that is, I think, left to be determined just in terms of where we are, as an industry. But I think that it will be highly competitive for the next several years. as the great race, kind of continues for that type of control.
Do you think that we'll start to see more backward integration? So forward integration, meaning I'm a fertility clinic, and then maybe I acquire, an OBGYN or some sort of referral source. I'm getting closer to the end patient, and backward being go back to the raw material. You could go all the way as far back to the raw materials, but just in that direction, whether you go that far back or not. Will we see more backward integration?
I definitely think we will. There will be some groups that will look, in terms of the backward review lens mirror, and they'll probably be ones that I think, as we naturally go through this process and we see where success is on the front end, they'll look at, what can the back end of the equation be? And does that give me any, strategic advantage over those that are offering, things on the front end? If you can contract with the patient up front, then you control the pathway in terms that they follow, right? And that's what some of the benefit providers have done a masterful job of. Okay. They have, in terms of the patient, their points of care, if they're going to be established to their network, then from a competitive standpoint, you're then, you've plugged them into your equation, right? You have to naturally manage them through the process, but you have control at that point.
Will we see tomorrow buying a fertility clinic network? Or will we see tomorrow buying a Hamilton Thorne or?
No, so at this stage, I think, if anything I've learned in 30 years of business, try to do one thing, do it well, okay, and be the best at it, right? And that sounds, cavalier, but it's the honest to God truth. It's, we obviously built a technology platform. We're the only company that wrote its own, operating program, IVFOS. It's proprietary to tomorrow. The first step was to automate, obviously, the storage, component of the business and bring as much digital, kind of chain of custody, protection to that side of the business as possible. We're obviously in the midst of, of launching this in the US now. And what's quite interesting is normally when you launch new technology, networks aren't generally the first adopters. They have bigger operations, and they're generally, you succeed with them later in an equation. But for tomorrow, it's inverse. It's the opposite. And so the obvious question is why? And I think that there's more of a strategy to manage the risk side of this business from a higher level. And they see, obviously, also from their buyer standpoint, that they need better digital chains of custody and better, traceability, more importantly, in this side of the equation. And who's got the best platform to do that? Obviously, tomorrow's got a very established FDA-cleared system. And so that's been the natural pathway that we'll follow. And I think that automation in the, in the lab is definitely a path that we'll continue to go upstream with. We think that there's a lot of ways to obviously improve, the day-to-day lives of laboratories. And we're concentrated on going upstream to deliver that. We have our partner in Conceivable, obviously, our founders from tomorrow that are creating another lab automated company that will probably, be a nice, development house for tomorrow, based services and products in the future as they continue to innovate on that side.
Do you think it's inevitable for those behemoths that we were talking about before? Like if you're KKR and you're picking up your EVRMA for $3.5 billion or whatever, I don't remember how much it was at that time, but and you see it working, it seems like if you really believe in assisted reproductive technology as part of your thesis and that company is profitable in your portfolio, to me, then it seems like, yeah, let's go out and get a storage company. Let's go out and get Progeny. Well, that would be hard to take Progeny off of the market, but let's buy, if not Hamilton Thorne, at least try to get them to sell us one of their brands. Is it inevitable to see backward integration with the behemoths coming in?
Yeah, so consolidation is obviously part of the world. I think, to run a medical device company versus to run a healthcare services company are very different, kind of management skills. And obviously they fit under the same therapeutic area, but they have very different business models. And there's usually very different skill sets that succeed in managing those types of businesses. I think that, what we see in a lot of other industries and within medicine is you see people, consolidate where it naturally fits. And then you see them obviously partner where it doesn't naturally fit. And I think the naturally fit part is where our space is, still going through the evaluation of what really fits under, let's say, a healthcare services model and what really fits under a medical device or a pharmaceutical model. And that's where, that's just kind of the natural growth that we see in terms of reproductive health. I think it's the right focus. And more importantly, I think what it will do is it'll help deliver high quality care, and will continue to attract, obviously the trust of more people based on the higher quality of care that we'll provide. I think that, for example, the Hamilton Thornes of the world, there's continued demand for them to innovate, bring more technology to the market. I think the partnerships between industry and healthcare services, you'll see, for example, innovation funds of a lot of the large networks now, like US Fertility, Pinnacle, for example. They're all going to have their own types of innovation funds, and they're going to make investments into the technologies in the early stages that they see will benefit their day-to-day care, management. And so that's, I think, what's been lacking in the past, and we'll see that as a very, important component of the future, of care in IVF.
You're not a lawyer, but I want you to speculate a bit, because all of this begs the question of when we might start to see antitrust regulators come in. Do you know of, can you speak to any red flags of when they would come in, and how likely it might be?
Yeah. So look, I think that we saw our first signal of antitrust in this space when Cooper, was focused on acquiring the assets of Cook for the women's health business. And antitrust, obviously, as they mentioned in their public disclosures, they had some reviews that they had to go through. They just made an announcement in their last quarterly earnings that they're no longer pursuing that acquisition. So I think that is the first signal in terms of we have the attention of the regulators in this space. All right. And ones would argue that now, over 50% of IVF cycles are now controlled by IVF networks. Okay. So we reached, let's say, a milestone that, people are going to start to pay attention in terms of the consolidation of clinics. It does seem that there's general momentum in those directions. So, I'm not going to, speculate that I know anything more than that. I could point to Australia as an example. So Australia actually, as a competition authority, got involved, I think close to 7 years ago, when they reached a 50% kind of milestone in their market comparably. And they basically, have not allowed, let's say, the big three to consolidate any more of the market to protect, some independent, offerings. So I think it's, we are starting as young industry, we're starting to lobby a lot more. And I think we're starting to help, a lot of, different government officials understand the importance of reproductive health care. We obviously have declining fertility rates in this country and every major G7 country for that matter. So the importance of actually supporting reproductive health care could probably never be more important. All right. So what do we do with that as an industry and as a specialty in terms of how we, utilize that momentum within Washington to support, the continued expansion of this service?
Lou, I deliberately didn't even go too deeply into the 5 core pillars of the ancillary services: the safety and technology stores, own labs, the egg banks, the surrogacy services, because I want to have you back on. I wanted to use this episode as painting the picture of what's going on in vertical integration. I would love to have you back on in the fall to go more deeply into these. And unlike the director of the Hangover movies, my sequels are always better. Louis Villalba, current CEO of Tomorrow, and congratulations on that new post, by the way. Thank you so much for coming on the Inside Reproductive Health podcast.
Thank you, Griffin. It's a joy to be with you, and appreciate the kind remarks. Thanks very much.
This episode was brought to you by Surrogacy Roadmap, a self-led educational course created by Family Inceptions. Guide your patients to Surrogacy Roadmap for all independent journeys. Get your free lesson from surrogacyroadmap.com/4-professionals. That's surrogacyroadmap.com/4-professionals. Today's advertiser helped make the production and delivery of this episode possible for free to you. But the themes expressed by the guests do not necessarily reflect the views of Inside Reproductive Health, nor of the advertiser. The advertiser does not have editorial control over the content of this episode, and the guest's appearance is not an endorsement of the advertiser. Thank you for listening to Inside Reproductive Health.